I'm going to play you a vocal twice, each one processed with the same delay. The only difference between them is one will have some extra techniques applied that makes it stand out and sound more interesting. Which one do you think sounds better?
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
The difference is night and day, right? Of course, the delay pattern itself is the same, but one sounds more unique, professional, and most importantly, more impactful. In this video, I'm showing you exactly how I achieved this transformation through 6 powerful techniques that you can mirror in your own mixes as well. And to do that, I'll be using a new delay plugin called Analog Drift from Phantom Sounds to demonstrate, but these techniques can definitely be adapted to many other delays out there, often in combination with other processing and effects, as we'll discuss in a moment. Analog Drift streamlines this process and has some unique features that really sets it apart, as you're going to see throughout the rest of this video. It gives you access to 3 unique echo modes with their own distinct sonic character, being glass delay, prism shift, and vaporwave bliss, each catering to sounds ranging from vocals to percussion, leads, pads, and more. It also has essential processors built right in, like saturation, tape effects, modulation, reverb, and even a vocal ducker, tools that I'd normally have to use separately to enhance my delays. Really, this plugin is like having 3 delays in one, with a bunch of useful features that make it an excellent all-in-one package, and arguably one of the most versatile delays out there. If you're curious to check out Analog Drift yourself, you can do a free 14-day trial. I'll leave links down in the description and pinned comment below for you to do that. And if you like it, you could score it right now for just $59, down from the regular price of $79, plus get an extra 10% off by using my code 5piece10 at checkout. Now remember the difference between those first 2 delay examples? The first technique that I use there and I want to share with you is to sculpt the delay with filters. This is honestly a simple yet crucial method for achieving a unique sound. We typically want our delays to repeat sections, but those repeats should sound distinct from the actual dry vocal that's being performed, letting the listener know that it's actually something else. To do that, we can use our delay's built-in filters to sculpt the sound, creating a unique texture that stands apart from the vocal itself. Now, if your delay doesn't have built-in filters like Analog Drift does, you can always slap on an EQ before or after our delay to mirror what we're doing here. With that in mind, there are 2 filtering techniques that we're going to implement. First, we'll use a low cut or a high pass filter on the low end, which will remove low frequencies, creating a lighter, airier texture from the delay. This will also help avoid muddiness and low frequency buildup, leading to a cleaner mix while letting other elements dominate the low end without interference. Second, we'll use a high cut or a low pass filter to remove high end frequency information, replicating the sound of analog hardware and creating an overall warmer sound from the delay. This will also help reduce any harshness or excessive high frequency presence, allowing our dry vocal to stand out. Now, of course, how much should be removed exactly will vary on a track-to-track basis, but typically this means removing the low end anywhere from 100 to 300, maybe even as high as 400 hertz, and also removing the high end anywhere from 15,000 hertz all the way down to 5,000 hertz. Basically, the more low end you cut, the thinner the delay sound is going to be, and the more high end you cut, the darker and potentially warmer the delay sound is going to be. So in my case, I'm actually going to reset both of these. I'm going to play this and then use my ears to set both of these up to find the most optimal setting for my track, at least based on my tastes.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
So I ultimately settled on some hard numbers here, being 300 hertz and 5000 hertz, which is really keeping this delay focused into the middle of the frequency range, cutting off some excessive high end, some excessive low end, and ultimately producing this thinner yet warmer sound at the same time, and one that sounds distinctly different from the dry vocal that's being performed, while still filling in the gaps between the vocal performance. Now, the second technique I want to talk about is to use saturation to enhance presence. Delays can sometimes get lost, especially on smaller speakers. Saturation can help by adding harmonic distortion, which thickens the delays and gives them a bigger, fuller sound with more impact. To do that, we can add tape or tube saturation, or even a preamp with the gain knob to introduce some subtle harmonic distortion. There are of course going to be a lot of variables when using another plugin to achieve this, especially since every saturator is a little bit different. But overall, the intention is generally the same, to increase the harmonic content in order to help the delay stand out. As I mentioned earlier, analog drift has a lot of these essential processes built right in, and the same goes here with this drive section, which is essentially a saturation section built into the plugin. Really, this has just two simple controls, a bias and a density. Bias essentially controls the tonal balance of the saturation being applied. Higher settings, like where it is now, results in a clearer, brighter tone, while lower values introduce more warmth and distortion. Basically, bias affects the actual character of the sound. Density, however, determines how much harmonic distortion is actually applied. Increasing this setting adds to the harmonic richness of the signal, making the delays sound warmer and thicker. Keeping it at a lower setting, however, allows it to be more subtle and transparent, with the signal being cleaner and retaining more of its original clarity. So let's play with these two settings and see what we can do here. I'm likely going to start by just driving up the density first and figuring out where I like the bias in terms of the texture and the feedback that we're getting, and then adjusting both of these settings to find something that sounds more appropriate.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
So right here at about 80% on the bias and 71% on the density is what I've settled on. You can tell that when I swept the bias around, it is really sounding a lot cleaner and more articulated, a little bit less noticeably distorted and more of a subtle saturation when you're leaning towards that 100%, which I obviously think does sound more transparent and is probably going to lend itself better in most situations. However, when I was starting to go closer to that 0% on the bias, you're starting to get a more blatantly affected, distorted, bit crushed almost type of sound in a way. You're getting a lot more of those artifacts and that noticeability from the distortion. And obviously that's not always going to work in every situation. I don't think it works particularly for this track, but I do think it's an interesting creative option that could work depending on what material you're affecting. Now, the density itself obviously controls how present it is, how much you can hear it. It's almost like a dry wet knob in a way. It's not exactly that, but it's just really allowing you to hear and notice the level of that distortion. And right here at about 71% felt pretty good for me. Overall, you can just hear how this has increased the presence and noticeability of it, especially when I take it out. Things just seem a little bit quieter, a little bit less noticeable, and this is really going to make a difference on devices that are not as great at reproducing these frequencies, small devices in particular. This is really going to help the delays cut through those devices and ultimately help with the translation of the delay as a whole. But now let's explore our third technique, which is to add character and texture with tape emulation. Tape emulation plugins can add subtle imperfections and irregularities, making the delay sound more organic and vintage. Now, fair warning, this type of effect may not be appropriate for every track, but when it is, it can be a powerful tool to create a distinctive delay sound. Similar to our other approaches, you can achieve this by slapping on a dedicated tape emulation plugin after your delay, or if you're using analog drift like I am, you can easily access this functionality with its built-in tape controls. These controls ultimately emulate the behavior of classic analog tape machines, adding a touch of unpredictability to the delay through its 4 key parameters. These parameters are where, Dust, Wow, and Flutter. These settings are also commonly found across many tape emulation plugins out there, but having access to them right here just makes this a lot simpler. Now, the Wear control simulates the gradual degradation of a tape machine over time. Increasing this parameter introduces irregularities and dropouts, giving the delay a rougher, more aged character. Let's hear what that sounds like.
I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark.
Now, in a way, I would actually liken this to a high-cut filter, sort of like what we have here. You could hear how it's obviously making things sound darker, a little bit less intelligible, a little bit less clear, but it is adding a bit more than just that. But that's sort of how I would liken it in this case. Let's take a look at the dust control next. This introduces the characteristic clicks and pops of a worn record, adding a vintage lo-fi texture. You can tell this is a presence thing because it sits at 0 dB, and I could just basically increase it and make them more and more present. So let's just play this quickly and we can hear it.
I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
So obviously a very distinctive sound here that we're getting, and it's a bit random, very unpredictable, just adding a little bit of that noise, that gritty kind of texture that may or may not work depending on the track. Moving on to the wow control, this adds a slow, subtle pitch variation which mimics the inconsistencies of tape speed. Cranking it up specifically creates a more pronounced wobble, perfect for lush, detuned echoes. Let's see what this sounds like.
I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
So of course this is pushed excessively at this moment. You could really hear the detuned nature of the sound, but adding a little bit could be pretty interesting. We'll explore that in a moment, but before we do that, let's reset this to 0 and talk about the final parameter here, which is flutter. The flutter control mimics the irregularities of tape caused by tape tension issues specifically, which adds fast and random pitch fluctuations. Basically, this control adds movement and instability to the delay signal, producing a more organic and expressive character, which I'm going to show you right now.
I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
You can really hear that movement. It's almost like a tremolo type of effect in a way. And obviously, again, pushed really hard in this particular case. So I'm going to bring it down to 0 again, but you can hopefully hear what that sounds like. Now, even though all these parameters are available, we can obviously pick and choose which of these we actually use based on what's appropriate for our song. For example, dust might not necessarily be appropriate in this case, unless you're purposely going for a lo-fi sound, especially if you're applying this to something else like drums, for example. However, some of these other settings like Wear, Wow, and Flutter, they can be a bit more versatile and help craft a unique feel and texture within this example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this and adjust each of these to find a combination that seems to work best for this track.
I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not parts of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
Now these settings right here seem to be a lot more appropriate, adding just a little bit of each to ultimately enhance the vibe, the texture, the feeling of the delay. Adding a little bit of wear, for example, so that way it's not so clear and articulate. Introducing some of that detuned nature here with the wow setting, which to be fair, I might reduce a little bit in the coming steps, but somewhere around here seems pretty decent. And then adding a little bit more movement with the flutter as well. Again, we're using this just to add a little bit more variety and unpredictability to the delay, and I think we're able to achieve that here with these settings built right into analog drift. Now we could further enhance the depth and texture of our delays with the fourth technique, which is using modulation to create a chorus-like effect. While the previous wow and flutter settings that we just added to our signal are obviously introducing some modulation, this technique I'm talking about here adds a more pronounced swirling movement by subtly varying the pitch of the delayed signal, making it more dynamic and evolving. You can achieve this by adding a modulation effect like a flanger, phaser, chorus, or another type of pitch modulator after your delay if you are using third-party plugins to achieve this. Or if you're using analog drift like I am, you can explore its built-in modulation options. Now up until this point, I've stayed in the glass delay echo mode, which is basically a clean, pristine digital delay without any coloration. But as I mentioned earlier, analog drift has other echo modes available, and these can actually add modulation directly to your signal. For example, the Vaporwave Bliss mode automatically adds a chorus effect and slow pitch modulation, instantly creating a dreamy, nostalgic vibe. Let's hear how this sounds in comparison to the glass delay that I was just on.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
A completely different vibe, as you can tell. Alternatively, the Prism Shift Echo mode is an evolving delay that filters through a range of frequencies with each repeat, creating a shimmering type of effect that changes with each echo. Let's give that one a listen in comparison.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
So just a heads up, I did bump down the feedback to 30% just because for some reason in this mode, the repeats and echoes are just a little bit crazier, a little bit more long-winded in comparison to the others, but hopefully you could hear the difference between the three. So the big question is, which of these three feels most appropriate for the track? For me personally, the Vaporwave mode with the original feedback setting seems to add just the right amount of movement and analog vibe, but without being too heavy-handed in comparison to the Prism Shift. The Prism Shift, while interesting, is a bit too intense for this particular track, at least in my opinion. So for that reason, I'm going to be sticking in the Vaporwave Bliss Echo mode and the way that it adds that chorus-like texture moving forward. Now our fifth technique focuses on enhancing the width of our delays to create a more spacious and immersive sound. There are a few ways to achieve this, but the easiest is to simply use a ping-pong mode built into your delay. This type of delay alternates the repeats between the left and right channels, creating a distinctive back and forth effect that widens the stereo image. This is a fairly common feature you'll find on a lot of delay plugins out there, and analog drift is no different. You could simply enable the ping pong mode directly within the plugin, and it'll instantly add this variation between the left and right channels, creating a wider sounding delay that stands apart, like so.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
And that's already creating a more distinctive delay sound, even with that subtle variation. And while ping pong delay is a great way to widen the stereo image, we could take it even further with a feature that's unique to analog drift, being its mid-side mode. By enabling this, we can apply separate delays to the mid or center and side or stereo signals, opening up interesting creative possibilities for enhancing stereo width. This mode ultimately keeps the initial delays focused and in the center, but then allows the following echoes to spread across the stereo field. Even just simply enabling the mid-side mode, just like I've done here, and leaving the mid and side settings the same as they are from before, should produce a noticeable difference. Let's actually check it out.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
Hopefully you can hear how that initial echo, like I said, is pretty much focused in the center, but then as the repeats continue, it's sort of spreading across the stereo field and creating this more expansive, wider, immersive type of experience. Now, if you really want to get creative here, you can actually use different patterns for the mid and side channels. So if I take off the link, for example, and then increase the side here to a half a note while leaving the mid at a quarter note, we're now going to have two different patterns resonating throughout the field. And of course, this may not be appropriate for every single track, but you can imagine how this is going to open up some interesting creative possibilities. Let's see what this one sounds like in particular.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
And this is yet another reason why I like analog drift specifically. Having access to a mid-side mode like this is not something you commonly see on other delay plugins, and the truth is the second part of the technique that I just showed you, it's going to be really difficult to replicate that using other third-party tools. You need to have access to analog drift or a delay plugin that has MS functionality, but you could tell how this in particular could be very powerful if used correctly in a mix. Now that being said, even though this feature is super useful, I am going to go back into the ping pong mode for the rest of this example, as this should mirror what a lot of you are using at home if you aren't using analog drift, and I do just so happen to prefer that ping pong effect for this track specifically. Now moving into our sixth technique, we can add atmosphere to our delays by using reverb. Adding reverb to a delay creates a sense of depth and space, making the delay sound more natural and less like a distinct repeat. Applying one also smooths out the transition between the dry vocal and the repeats, which makes the delay sound less like a distinctive echo and more like a natural extension of the original sound. You can achieve this by applying a reverb plugin directly to your delay send, following the delay preferably, or you could even send your delay to your reverb bus and apply a certain amount of signal to that just like you would a dry vocal being sent via a bus. The second option will obviously give you a lot more control and more blending options at the same time. That being said, we're going to be using the built-in reverb that's included with analog drift. This is a simple one knob control. As you increase it, it adds more reverb presence to the delay, somewhat like a dry-wet mix knob at the same time. That being said, let's reset this to 0, play it, and see what sounds most appropriate for this track.
I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight. I wanna love you always, not part of your mind. I wanna love you all day, taking if you're mine. Take a trip out of space, get lost in your eyes. If my world gets dark, you're my moonlight.
There really is a delicate balance to this, as you can imagine, just like anything else when you're applying reverb. Me personally, I aim for a balance where the reverb enhances the delay's spatial presence, but without fully drowning it out. Now, I think this setting sounds best because it adds just a nice sense of space, but without muddying the delay up too much or making it sound too distant, as I did when I pushed it, for example, to 100%. For this track, I'm definitely aiming for a cleaner aesthetic, but with just a touch of atmosphere. But overall, adding reverb to delay, even if it's as simple as what I've just done right here, which is just simply adding it through analog drift's built-in features, is a simple but powerful technique for adding more depth, space, and dimension to your delay sound. Overall, you can hopefully hear how my delay went from a basic one to one that sounds distinct, unique, and much more impactful through the 6 techniques that I showed you throughout this video. Even better, instead of relying on 6 different plugins ranging from delay to EQ to saturation, reverb, and more, I was able to achieve all of this with an analog drift itself, demonstrating its power and versatility. And we didn't even take advantage of certain features like its built-in ducker, for example, which I've left in its default state. But either way, with its unique features including mid-side mode, tape emulation, and the other built-in processors like filters, saturators, reverbs, and more, you can easily create delays that sound polished, professional, and inspiring. This also happens to be the first plugin from Phantom Sounds, and they're off to a great start here. I'm really excited to see what they cook up next. Once again, if you want to try it out, you can do a free 14-day trial by using the links down in the description and pinned comment below. And if you decide to purchase it, be sure to use my discount code 5piece10 at checkout to save an extra 10% off. But now it's your turn. Get out there and start experimenting with these techniques in your own mixes, because the best way to really cement something you've learned through a video like this one is to apply it immediately. And if you have any questions or want to share your own delay tips, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to see more mixing tips like this in the future. I'll also leave some other delay and vocal mixing videos on screen for you to watch next, which should continue to help, and I look forward to seeing y'all again soon. Peace.
5.